There's a prayer that is a great favorite of mine by the Benedictine nun Macrina Wiederkehr. And it says, God, help me to believe the truth about myself, no matter how beautiful it is. God, help me to believe the truth about myself, no matter how beautiful it is. And when I give that prayer to people to sit with and to pray with, they often balk at it. It's kind of a sense that we find it easier to believe that the truth about ourselves is something negative, that what God sees as our shortcomings and our failures and our sins. But the deeper truth is that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that we are created intrinsically good, that we are loved beyond measure, and that God is head over heels crazy about us, that we are the beloved and the friend of God, and that God is always seeing us through kind and loving eyes. But just as we struggle a lot sometimes with our image of God, we also often struggle with that image of ourselves. And we struggle with that often because as children, when we grow up, we tend to internalize some of the false messages that are out there. And we often pick up things like, I'm not lovable, or I don't belong, or I'm not good enough, or I'm only good enough if X or if Y. And that often comes because the significant others in our lives, for some reason, need us to perform or to please or to live up to their expectations. And we kind of interiorize something that says, I'm not okay, I'm not enough. In my own life, my father, who was a really good person, but who struggled with his own brokenness, his own fragility, really wanted me to be the daughter that he could show off to the world, the daughter in whose achievements he could revel. And I really had a sense that, there was that sense of affirmation that came when I was doing well, and always the fear that if I didn't do well, that if somehow my performance wasn't up to scratch, that somehow, even if it was almost imperceptible, that love or that approval would be withdrawn or withheld in some way. Sometimes people who are growing up in very hostile or abusive environments come out with a really strong sense of themselves as unworthy, unlovable, ugly, and often develop a very strong inner critic, almost as a kind of protective mechanism to try and buffer themselves from the criticism that they fear from the outside world, from the sense that they have that other people are going to think that they are not okay or not enough. Our theology also often contributes to an image of ourselves, a view of ourselves that is not a very positive one. Often we have a theological understanding that really has a sense that if we sin, God will withdraw from us. God will not love us anymore. And so when we inevitably do sin, we feel somehow that God has distanced God's self from us, or we just distance ourselves from God preemptively because we have that fear or that worry. We know that Ignatius himself really struggled with his own image of self. When he was in his early time in Manresa, he had a sense of himself and his sinfulness as being so ingrained and so powerful, that negative self-image and feeling about himself, that he was constantly going to confession and trying to find a way to move out of that negative sense of self, but nothing helped until he was able to surrender to the sense of God's grace and God's gaze on him, which only came after a very big struggle. It's not to say that we don't need to repent and we don't need to kind of come back to God again and again. We do. But when we come back to God out of that space of knowing that God's loving gaze rests on us, that we are God's beloved, God's friend, that we are created and chosen and called and cherished, we come back with that deep sense of groundedness in God and that ability to receive that love of God that is there waiting for us and poured out for us in absolutely every moment. When we looked at image of God, we said that it was integrally connected with image of self. And we come back to that now as we look at our image of self. When we see God as a demanding parent, someone with high expectations of us, we may kind of put ourselves in the place of needing to please and to perform. When we see God as the one who delights in me, like a grandparent with a child collecting shells along the beach and playing together. When we see God as the one who delights in me, like a grandparent with a child collecting shells along the beach and playing together. Or the parent who is teaching their toddler to walk. There is a sense of being a cherished, loved child who is safe, who is secure, who is able to explore freely. When I see God as desiring to be close to me, to be in a relationship of intimacy with me, I might see myself as the beloved who is desired by God, like that beloved in the Song of Songs. When I see God as a faithful, dependable friend, I myself will feel drawn into wanting to respond as a faithful friend in return. I want to share a story of a friend of mine who has given permission for her own experience to be shared that just maybe picks up on some of this. She grew up in a family where her parents were chronically ill and her father was someone that she had to take care of from a very young age. And she had an image of God as someone who was depleted and exhausted and burdened by the needs of the world and the unreciprocated love of humanity. And she had a sense of herself as being one who was a drain on God's energy. And so she was always trying to make herself smaller. And then she went into the experience of the spiritual exercises. And the person who was accompanying her offered her that text from Ephesians that says, "You are God's work of art." And she stayed with that text for quite some time. And as she prayed into it, she came to a sense of God as creator, as God with this life-giving, creative, abundant energy, as a God who was delighting in the activity of creating. And as her image of God shifted in a very profound way, she came to have a sense of her own image of God, herself shifting as well. She started to see herself as someone in whom God took great delight. And she said, if God really delights in me, if I give God joy, maybe I am allowed to be happy. Maybe I don't have to spend my life making reparation for my existence. It was a key turning point in her life. I like to think about image of God using 4 C's. That we are created, we are chosen, we are called, and we are cherished. And there's something mind-boggling about that when we have a sense of ourselves as being all of those things, as being created, chosen, called, and cherished. And I want to spend a little bit of time with each of those. If we go to this idea that we are created, we think of Psalm 139, that beautiful psalm about being created by God in our mother's womb, of God knowing us intimately, even in the moments of our creation, putting us together with such tenderness and such care. And God's joy and delight, God having envisaged our creation since before the world began. Something so powerful about that. And then the sense that God is taking joy in that, taking joy in his creation. When I think about creating myself, I know that, every time one of my godchildren has been born, I have crocheted a prayer blanket for them. I've taken a lot of care to choose the colors, the different colors of wool that I've used, the stitches, the pattern. And as I have created each blanket, I have sat and prayed, thinking about the child who will be coming into the world, the child who is going to be born. And I think there's something of that feeling, that joy in creating and investing time and energy and love. But God's creating of us is not over. God didn't create us and then step back. God continues to create us in an ongoing way, in a way that is unfolding all the time. Like that image in Jeremiah 18 of the potter with the clay. God is constantly shaping us and reshaping us and making us more and more the fullness of who God longs for us to be. And as we are part of this unfolding, we are called to collaborate with God in our own creation, which is an awesome, amazing idea that somehow God is inviting me to be part of his creating of me, of part of who I am becoming. And then if we think about the fact that we are chosen by God. There's something incredibly powerful about that I am chosen and that choosing will never be withdrawn. I will never be unchosen. Another remarkable thing about being chosen is that it's not exclusive. The fact that I am chosen doesn't mean that anyone else is not chosen. Henry Nouwen says that when we become aware of our own chosenness, our eyes are opened to the chosenness of others too. This whole idea of being chosen is one that for me personally is deeply healing and deeply important. I've had a number of experiences in my own life where I've experienced myself as being chosen and then having that chosenness be taken back or being withdrawn. And that has meant that the experience of knowing that I am chosen by God is particularly powerful. When I think back to my high school years, in my final year of high school, I was chosen to be part of the final ballet performance and to perform a solo for that. And it was something that was really exciting, and I looked forward to it, and I practiced, and I really gave my heart and my soul into that work. And a couple of days before the performance, I was called into the office of those who were producing it and the teachers, and I was told that they were pulling the piece that I was doing because my performance wasn't going to be of a good enough standard. And I experienced myself in that moment as being unchosen. And that was a devastating kind of experience, to go home and tell my family that I was no longer going to be doing what I had originally been chosen to do. And perhaps, certainly more deeply, the experience of having been very much in love and having thought that experience would last a lifetime, until the person who I was in love with decided that they were no longer in love with me. And so there was a very powerful moment for me when I was able to recognize my own chosenness and the fact that would never be lost or withdrawn. And that happened when I was around 31, and I went on retreat. I went to my favorite retreat center, which is a beautiful place in South Africa that looks out over the sea. It's got a beautiful glass chapel. And it was about day 5 of the retreat. And I was sitting there and I was praying and I was grappling because at that stage of my life, so many of my friends had got married. And there were a number of my closest friends who were getting married within a couple of months that lay ahead. And I had the sense of, does no one choose me? Why am I not chosen? And I had the most profound prayer experience of my life so far, of God really saying to me in a way that I could not take in at a profound level, I have chosen you for myself. And that experience has been etched into my heart, that sense that God has chosen me and that I will never be unchosen. And as true as that is for me in the particulars of that deep, deep experience with God, that chosenness is true for all of us, that each of us is chosen by God in a particular and powerful way. And then if we think about that third C, I am called. I am drawn by God into partnership with God. I am drawn to become a partner with God in his dreams and hopes and desires for the world, to bring the gifts and talents and personhood that God has made me with to be part of what God is doing, to be part of his activity and action in the world. And there's an enormous sense of privilege in that we are called. Ignatius experienced himself as being called to help souls. That was the term that he always loved to use, that he felt he was invited to help souls, and that he did in many ways, in spiritual conversations with people, and very powerfully through friendship and through the spiritual exercises. And each of us in our own particular way is called, whether we are called as parents, whether we are called in our particular work context, whether we are called in a particular ministerial context, we are invited into this partnership with Christ, to be with him, to labor with him in the vineyard. And I think that, even though we are aware that we have flaws, we struggle, we sin, we mess up, and still we are called. That Ignatius talks in the exercises and draws us into this experience that we are loved sinners. We are loved sinners called by God. And if we think about someone like Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, and yet in the next moment we hear Jesus saying, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep." He is called despite those moments that all of us too experience of turning away, of denying God. We are still called. And then there is that last word, cherished. We are cherished. We are loved, we are protected, we are enveloped in God's love. We are beloved. And we are invited to live the truth of our belovedness. So what happens when we truly and deeply live the truth of our belovedness? I think the first thing is we're able to ditch the lies, the untruths about ourselves. Those things, those voices that go on in our minds that we are not loved, that we don't belong, that we're not enough, that we're not worthy, that we're able to let those go and to recognize that I am God's beloved and God's friend, that I am created, chosen, called, cherished. And that gives an immense freedom. I don't have to bend over backwards trying to be someone that I'm not. I can truly be who I am and know that I am loved by God unconditionally as I am. To live the truth of my belovedness also means an invitation and an energy to respond generously, to respond wholeheartedly to Christ. It's not that I come to the sense of my belovedness and then I hit a kind of complacency and I don't have to worry about, anything anymore. I can just go on with life in any way I like. No, that's not what happens at all. That as we come to know how beloved we are, there is a desire that is evoked in me to want to walk even more closely with the one who loves me, to want to serve, to want to offer all of who I am. And the next part of living the truth of my belovedness is that I accept my gifts and my limitations. I don't have to compete with anyone else anymore. I can truly be myself. But I think we often need to be reminded. We sometimes have these experiences where we come to a sense of how loved we are, where our image of self shifts profoundly. And then as we go through stressful times in our lives, as we hit difficult moments, sometimes what happens to us is that we lose touch with that. We forget our belovedness. And so it's really, really important for us to often go back to experiences in which we have felt God saying to us, God allowing us to experience and to know that we are unconditionally loved by God. And even Jesus needed that affirmation. If we think about the stories of the baptism and the transfiguration, the baptism before he starts his life of ministry, this is my beloved Son. If we look at the transfiguration, which comes shortly before he faces the passion, again, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Could it be that God is well pleased with us too? What does it feel like to hold that question deep within us? So, as we hold on to the sense of our deepest identity, of who it is that we are called to be, living out that creation that we are in God's image and likeness, we become more and more our full selves. And we listen to what is affirming, what is life-giving, and it changes us. The writer Henry Nouwen, in his book, The Life of the Beloved, says these words that I find really powerful. He says that the real work of prayer is to become silent and to listen to the voice that says good things about us, to gently push aside and silence the voices that question my goodness, and to trust that we will hear the voice of blessing. Trevor Hudson, in his book, Seeking God, invites us into an exercise which he calls the Beloved Charter, inviting us to look in the scriptures for God's words of affirmation and promise and love, and to weave into a paragraph or so those pieces, those words that really resonate for us most deeply, those words that we sense ourselves hearing from God, that echo within us. And this is a really powerful thing to do because it allows us to really stay with what God is saying to us. And I want to share with you just a few of the phrases that are in my own beloved charter as I engage in this exercise. Anne-Marie, you are my beloved. I have chosen you for myself, and I will never unchoose you. I quiet you with my love. I rejoice over you with happy song. I bring you into a spacious place. I rescue you because I delight in you. Remain in my love. And remember, you did not choose me. No, I chose you, and I commissioned you to go out and to bear fruit, fruit that will last. When we allow ourselves to soak in the words and the promises of God, when we allow ourselves to be drenched in the gaze of God that pours out on us, then over time we become able to believe those words of that prayer by Macrida Vidakere. We become able to believe something of the truth about ourselves, no matter how beautiful it is.
Some of the obstructions to believing that we are beautiful in God's eyes is what we experience as children, the messages that we get about ourselves. So often we are told we are not good enough, or we are not fast enough, or very often even people are told physically they don't look right. And this can be a real hindrance for people in viewing themselves, and a real blockage to seeing that in God's eyes we are beautiful.
I think some of the obstructions to believing that we are beautiful in God's eyes are the experiences that we have growing up, the experiences that form us as young children, as adults getting into the world, that the feedback that we get from significant others often gives us a sense that we are not enough, that we are not okay, that we are somehow defective. And that's why it's difficult sometimes for people to believe in their own goodness or their own beauty.
I think some of us, and I include myself, sometimes we struggle to really believe that we are beautiful in God's eyes. And I think there could be a number of factors around that. If I were to speak very personally, I kind of had a very, and I'm sure it's related to upbringing, a deep sense that I would be beautiful in God's eyes if I can earn somehow God's care and God's love in my life. And I think for many people, there is a sense that we earn, we need to earn the right to be seen as beautiful in God's eyes. And I think something shifts very deeply in our life when that is our starting point, not our end point. That the starting point is that we are precious image bearers, that we are profoundly cherished and loved by God, and knowing that God finds me lovable. It helps me to begin to believe that I really am beautiful in God's eyes.
When a person begins to see themselves as God sees them, I believe that what happens is they recognize the potential within them that they had not recognized before. The potential for goodness, the potential for service of others, the potential to live hope-filled lives.
So much is made possible when people begin to see themselves as God sees them. They tend to blossom. There's a growth in self-acceptance, in a sense of freedom, often a sense of confidence, and an ability to be more present and more compassionate with other people.
You know, I think that when we begin to see ourselves, as it were, through God's eyes, and when we begin to perhaps accept that we are lovable, and that we are beautiful in God's eyes. I think one of the consequences of that is a very deep freedom. And it's the freedom to become myself. The freedom to become the person that God wants me to be. That I don't have to be anyone else. And I'm set free from the imprisonment of comparison in my life with other human beings.